On the whiteboard, there's a date. Do any of you people know what that date refers to?
Wasn't there a little beep
Yep.
going on at that date?
October 4th, 1957. Yes, Sputnik. That's pretty good.
I think he's the youngest person in the room. He may be.
How many people knew that, actually? That's Sputnik. And I put that down because that is the date that's usually given for the beginning of modern math education in the United States. And so I thought we would start with that. And I would just sort of, I'm going to retitle this talk, A Curmudgeon Takes a Nostalgia Trip Through Math Education. So that's the date that caught the United States government and the military completely off guard. Nobody, as far as I know, knew that that was coming. And it was not unsimilar in that respect to 9/11, which also nobody saw was coming. The Soviet space program achieved several other space. Does anybody have any recollection of that year? Good. Then I don't have to worry about telling it the way it was. There was a series of Soviet triumphs at that time, which is impressive even today when you read them. Here they are. Soviets, the first dog in space, the first man in space, the first woman in space, the first 3 men in space, the first spacewalk, the first spacecraft to impact the moon, the first spacecraft to orbit the moon, the first spacecraft to impact Venus, and the first spacecraft to soft land on the moon. That's a pretty impressive set of achievements. And in the meantime, every single one of the first 19 U.S. efforts to go into space ended in failure. 19. Many of the failures were broadcast naturally on national TV. E.g., on December the 6th, a few inches above the launch pad, a spectacular fireball. It was dubbed by the press sometimes as Flopnik and sometimes as Stay Putnik.
Except where, but people died in that.
I don't know if that's the one that people
that was
died.
Apollo-
No, that was the lab. You know,
These were not manned.
these were unmanned. But the Stay Putnik I like a lot. 5 days after Sputnik, Eisenhower was unfazed. Eisenhower, for those who are too young to remember, was one of the presidents of the United States,
Among others.
among many
Among
others.
other achievements.
He was a president. And he said Sputnik, he told a press conference, quote, was only one small ball in the air. Only made possible, he added, because Russia had, quote, captured all the German scientists at the end of the Second World War. They missed one of those scientists, and that was Wernher von Braun, and we snapped him up. The U.S. in response, and I'll talk about this a little bit, launched the Apollo program, which was launched in 2 speeches, actually, by Kennedy became president in January of 1961, so somewhat later than Sputnik. And Kennedy made 2 speeches, one of them before Congress on May the 25th, 1961. He said, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No, and he continued, no single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important to the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar spacecraft. We propose to develop alternative liquid and solid fuel boosters much larger than any now being developed until certain which is superior. We propose additional funds for other engine development and for unmanned explorations which are particularly important for one purpose, which is that this nation will never overlook: the survival of the man who first makes this daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be one entire nation. For all of us must work to put him there. Now, Kennedy was well known for rhetoric and making very nice speeches, but it does seem to me that this has a tone which you would not hear today. That this is an important thing to do, and it's not because there's money in it. He made another speech on September the 12th at Rice University, which really actually did launch the Apollo program, in which he said the following: "But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic?" What was he referring to there? Lindbergh. "Why does Rice play Texas?" This was given at Rice University. "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard." I wish I could do the accent. "Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win." I read those two excerpts because I really do think, let me repeat, that this has a style and a kind of a substance to it that I don't think is quite the same today. I don't think that would inspire the public as it did then. And by the way, there were naysayers. Right here at the University of Illinois, there were naysayers. They said, we got better things to do than to go to the moon. Kennedy's goal was accomplished by the Apollo 11 mission. And can you name the astronauts?
Buzz, Neil, and Colin. And
Neil Armstrong,
Neil Armstrong, Buzz,
Louis Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin
Michael Collins.
landed their lunar module on July the 20th, 1969, and walked on the lunar surface, while Michael Collins remained in lunar orbit in the command service module. And all three landed safely on Earth, actually not so much on Earth as in the ocean, on July the 24th, 1969. So before the decade was over, and by quite a bit. I mean, they didn't do it the night before. The goal was accomplished with 5 months and some change to spare. In 1957, when Sputnik first went up, I could spend the whole period on this, there was a large and vociferous public response, which came in various forms. Some of the public reaction was outright panic, and others were quite indifferent to the whole thing. And there are Gallup polls to show that. It's quite interesting. The same rocket that launched Sputnik, people pointed out, could send a nuclear warhead anywhere in the world in a matter of minutes. And that made an impression on the American public, stripping the continental United States of its oceanic defenses. The Soviets had demonstrated this capacity, by the way, on the 21st of August with a successful 6,000-kilometer flight test of the R-7 booster. The U.S. had been rather smug about its clear and commanding lead in matters scientific and technological. Consider this. We beat two formidable enemies in World War II, the Germans on the one hand and the Japanese. We were the first to develop an atomic bomb, and the Soviets, it was believed at the time, had stolen the atomic bomb from the United States rather than develop it on their own. Sputnik was a clear wake-up call that we were not so great as we had imagined. People grumbled about the fact that our priorities and values were misplaced. One of the most, I think, interesting grumbles, and it was written about and discussed ad nauseum, had to do with cars. What was it that some people in the public kept rubbing our noses in? They said, that while the Soviets were producing Sputnik and rockets, our best engineers were in Detroit designing tail fins for Cadillacs. Do you all remember? Well, do any of you remember the tail fin era?
Chevrolet had them too.
They all copied them, of course, yes. And we put our engineers to work on designing tail fins for our cars. The Russians, with German help, of course, are designing rockets for spacecraft. And there was also an outcry that our schools were failing to produce scientists and engineers who could compete with the Russians, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, I want to make something that's good about the University of Illinois that we should all be proud of and that very few people know. Hours after Sputnik was launched, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign Astronomy Department rigged an ad hoc interferometer to measure the signals that Sputnik beeped out periodically. And two people, one of them was Donald Gillies. There was no computer science department then, but I think he must have been in physics or electrical engineering. Gillies was one of them, and the other one, this article refers to him as Jim Snyder. Did anybody actually know him? He was head of computer science after they had a computer science department here. And it struck me as a little odd because I have never thought of Jim Snyder as Jim Snyder. I only thought of him by the name that he went by, which was James Newton Snyder. But he was a brilliant physicist. And they together programmed Iliac-1 to calculate the satellite orbit from the data, so that they could. And they published that. The programming and calculation was completed in less than 2 days, and the rapid publication of the orbit in the journal Nature within a month of the satellite's launch helped to dispel some of the fears created by the Sputnik launch by the Soviet Union. So that was done right here at the University of Illinois. And that was quite an achievement to do. And I think I'll just stop for a minute and tell you a little bit about the situation of computer science in 1957. Iliac-1 was a machine that was designed at the University of Illinois and which was based on a series of machines which I think were mostly called ENIACs, which were developed by the Army at the Aberdeen Proving Ground where they did artillery stuff to see how to shoot big guns successfully. And that was developed there. And I thought it would be worth a few seconds to give you some of the Iliac parameters. The Iliac, by the way, was a machine that was roughly the size of that whiteboard if you put it down to the ground, and was probably about 2 feet or so thick. It was a pretty big machine. Here are some of the iliac parameters. It had a random access memory of what, do you think? In bytes.
64.
What?
64?
No, it was better than that. It was 8 kilobytes, 8,000 bytes of memory. And later on, and I'm not sure when that was done, there was a drum added to it. It was a rotating drum, and that had a capacity of 800 kilobytes. And what happened is this drum would rotate, and when it came into the reading and the writing heads, you could read off of it or you could write on it. But there were no discs and no tapes and nothing like that. It had a very basic assembly language available for programming, but it was very, very basic. It was basically machine language. A typical addition of two numbers took what? How many microseconds do you think that would take? 75 microseconds was a typical add time. The input was what?
Zeros and ones.
Well, yeah, zeros and ones. But what was the physical thing that you fed into?
Switches? Punch cards?
Pardon?
Punch cards?
Punch cards was the IBM version. The U of I version was punch paper tape. The same kind of tape that they used when Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, the stuff that they throw out of the Wall Street skyscrapers was paper tape. IBM used punch cards. You remember the motto that came with punch cards? Do not. That's part of it. There are 3 things you shouldn't do with punch cards.
Don't fold.
Do not fold, spindle, or mutilate. That was.
Take it, throw them away.
Yeah, but that's, so there were really 2 worlds. There was the world what some people called the scribes, who used paper tape that was sort of like a what do they call those things? That the Egyptian scroll, yeah. And then there were arguments as to whether there were the polar coordinate people and the rectangular coordinate people as to which of them was the more natural for people to use. And I would like to talk about that, but I can't. But there was some very modern engineering, and this is the last thing I'll say about iliac. There was some very modern engineering was built into the machine, and that is it was built with redundancies built in, which means that it achieved what was then considered a remarkable free error time. Do you know what I mean by that? That is, the time between the machine making mistakes was 24, on the average was 24 hours. And that was because it was a vacuum tube machine, and vacuum tubes, as you probably remember or know, don't last forever, and so they blow out, and then you have to. So that was the thing that was done. The iliac 1 was used. Does anybody know the word Plato?
Yes.
I don't mean the philosopher. I mean.
Sure. Plato. No,
Plato was a University of Illinois developed
online education.
an online education. It was developed here. I might say that I wrote the first program that made Plato possible. And it was as primitive as the machine that it was made for. But it was a great thing in its day, and it lasted quite a while. So what happened was, as a result, there was federal funding for STEM-like, that word wasn't invented yet, for STEM-like education, school education, to increase dramatically. I won't bore you with the numbers much, but this is an amazing number. 57, remember that Sputnik, 57. In 1953, federal spending for education was
200.
how much?
200 a student?
200?
Mm-hmm.
200 what?
50.
No, I mean 200.
$200.
No, federal education, the total budget for federal
Oh,
education.
I was talking per student, per student.
No, not per student,
Okay, I
just
don't know,
total.
I don't know, we're both, I don't know.
The total federal budget for education was $153 million, of which the colleges took, this will amaze you, 10 million. The entire federal education. Now that doesn't count things like the GI Bill, which I don't know if it was still running at that time, but for development and stuff like that.
Doesn't include military education.
And that, by 1960, that funding had increased sixfold. And it was all done with an act that was interestingly called the National Defense and Education Act. So it was passed through Congress on the grounds that this was vital to the national defense. And that was used in the name. And so now, so at the time that this new push that's continued to this day started, we have to always remind ourselves that there were, and still are, I think, essentially 15,000 independent school districts in the United States. And it's very hard to get 15,000 anythings to do what you want them to do. So that's one of the things. And so as the situation of math education in 1957 was really abysmal in this country. There was no textbooks were made by teachers, by ad hoc committees. They appealed to the lowest possible common denominator that you could possibly appeal to. They had the notion of a mathematician working on a textbook was unthinkable. It just didn't happen. So it was really bad. And the mathematical content of these books was poor. And the emphasis was on vocational education by and large. And the argument was, and in fact, employers did complain that their entry-level people can't do the math that the job requires. And that has always raised a question in my mind whether it really is the taxpayer's job to prepare people to do McDonald's jobs. I mean, why can't the employers train their people with their money rather than with taxpayer money? It's never been clear to me why that's a function that the state should undertake necessarily.
When did you write the Structures and Shrinkers series?
I'm sorry, that was much later. Let's talk about the new math.
Can I ask?
Yes.
You have a statistic down there about in 1957, what percent of high school students took a course called algebra?
I have that information, but not with me.
15%.
Yeah, something on that order.
Only 15% of high
Right.
school
And it was
students
going
took-
down, by the way.
Yes, we're taking a course called algebra
Yeah.
in 1957.
So let's now talk about the new math, which is what I want to talk about anyway. Actually, the story of math education reform at the University of Illinois precedes Sputnik by several years. And that's a kind of a nice thing for locals to know. It was done by an outfit called the University of Illinois Committee on School Mathematics. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. World War II ended on when?
August 14th, 1945.
Very good, 1945.
That was my husband's birthday.
It ended in August of 1945, and the GI Bill essentially guaranteed people who had fought in that war a college education, that the government would pay for a college education. And so thousands of GIs got into schools that would normally in previous years not have come. And university people, by and large, were really shocked by the mathematical incompetence of entering freshmen. In particular, here at this university, which was noted always for its engineering school, Bill Everett, who was the dean of education here, what?
Not education.
I don't mean education, engineering. Bill Everett, the dean of engineering, appointed a faculty committee to look into what could be done to improve the situation of engineering education at this university. And he did it, interestingly enough, he appointed 6 faculty members, 2 professors from the math department, 2 from engineering, and 2 from education. And those 6 people were charged with writing a report, the result of which was disseminated among high schools, was sent to every high school in the state of Illinois. If you have some spare time, you might want to go take a look at that report. It was called The Mathematical Needs of Prospective Students in the College of Engineering at the University of Illinois, U of I Bulletin, Volume 49, Number 18, October 1951. And it was 18 pages. You notice that in those days, snazzy, snappy titles were not a nation at risk or anything like that. Listed, and what this report essentially does, it's a fascinating report. It lists a bunch of topics in mathematics that were either indispensable, desirable, or optional. And this report was issued 6 years before Sputnik came on the scene. Some of the stuff that was considered desirable is very odd, and I wish we had time to look at it. One of them was something you don't even know exists. One of them was the ability to use successfully the square root algorithm. I don't mean Newton's method, I mean the square root algorithm, which is you double and then you bring it down. And, that was considered a desirable thing that should be introduced to the schools. I could do it. I can't. I sat down last night to do it, and I forgot the details. I must confess. I think I could figure it out if I had to. Now, one of the central figures in the U of I's role in math reform was a guy named Max Biberman. And I'd like to tell you a bit. Did anybody here conceivably actually, you might have known Max? No.
No, he died before I came. I moved here in 75. I think he died in 73, but I certainly don't know him.
Yeah.
I knew him and his kids.
Well, you knew him,
His
yeah.
wife stuff there.
His wife is still in town, do you know? Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sells jewelry at the farmer's market.
He died rather,
Max Biberman Award from ICTM
Yes.
last year.
Yes.
And my stepmother-in-law is the neighbor of Max's wife today.
really?
Connections here.
That's interesting.
And
So Max Biberman was a New Yorker from, I don't think he was from Brooklyn, I don't know where he was from, but he was from New York. And what? Wrong? Oh, the Bronx? Yeah?
We're in there, Bob.
Max came from the Bronx, and he had been drafted in World War II. And this story is not. Do you want me to not tell you this story, or do you want me to tell it to you? I mean, it's not math education, but it's a wonderful tale. He served. He was drafted like most people were. He was drafted into the Army, I think essentially straight out of high school. And he was sent to guess where? Think of the most remote place you can think of in the United States.
well, Alaska wasn't in the United States.
Well, sure it was. No, Alaska was in the United States. It wasn't a state, but it was.
Gizmo.
He was sent to Alaska. Where in Alaska?
Fairbanks.
Oh, the Fairbanks that was the Paris of Alaska.
No.
Nome, exactly. He was sent to Nome as a weather observer to report every day on the weather. And that's what he did after the war. I knew Max, and the notion of Max in an igloo in Alaska, just unthinkable to me. And when the war ended, he was, I guess, a sort of a lazy guy at that time because he decided to stay. So he stayed in Alaska and got a job at the local public school and taught math at the local public school. Then, and I'll make this a little shorter now, his wife appeared on the scene, and his wife did not come from New York. His wife came from a very prominent Tidewater, Virginia family whom she hated and wanted to get away as far as she possibly could. And she looked at the map and said, Nome, Alaska, that's it. And so she arrived, and they fell in love, and they. But Elizabeth said to Max after a couple of years, she said, you know, enough of this Nome already. We're not staying here. Max had serious doubts as to whether he could handle graduate school. But she persuaded him to come down, and the long story short, he ultimately got a PhD from Howard Fair, actually, at Teachers College in Columbia. And then he got a job at Uni High here. And so that's the story of Max Biberman. Now, the idea that Everett had is that we're going to strengthen the curriculum. And in order to do that, we have to write new materials and texts. And we have a perfect way of doing this because we have the lab school here. And in those days, it was a lab school and not a fake private boarding school. So Max was put in charge of doing that. And Max was aware of the fact that he was not a mathematician, but he learned that there was a mathematician here who had thought about these things, and that was Herbert Vaughan, who was actually, everybody says he was a logician, but he wasn't. He was a topologist, which is about the same thing. So he got, and Vaughan, and according to David, whatever his name is, the guy that,
Klein.
David Klein, this is not true, but I think it has some truth in it. Truthiness, right? He said, you want to know about high school education, how high school math should be taught? And he pulled out his desk drawer and he plunked a 500-page manuscript that he had written on Max's desk and said, this is how it should be done. And Vaughan's idea was it should be done essentially completely logically. I mean, starting with sets and Boolean algebra, and everything should be proved, and so on and so forth. And so that was, he had an enormous influence on Max, and some would say that he overemphasized formal logic and deduction. And then very early on, Max got a grant from the Carnegie Foundation, which is a private foundation, a smallish grant, and that's what he used to develop this stuff with. And one of the things that's interesting is after Sputnik, he got a big grant from NSF. And he always talked about the fact that the difference between the Carnegie grant and the NSF grant was dramatic. The Carnegie grant, they said once a year, send us a report on what you're doing, and that's it, and we'll look at it. NSF, every 3 weeks, wanted more evidence that this stuff works, and so on and so forth. So there's a price you pay for government. I need to move on. In fact, I should skip everything now. There's a lot of stuff here. If you want to hear it, I'm willing to come I'm willing to give evening lectures if you want to hear the whole thing. But I'm going to skip the, what?
Did you say an evening lecture?
Yeah,
With some wine, that's perfect.
yeah. So I'm going to skip the two things that are dear to my heart and skip everything else. One of them is the thing about.
February 27th is open. You can continue this Friday.
Will anybody show up?
I'll be here.
I'll be here.
I'll be here. We'll be here.
All right. So you want me to continue this?
I do.
Okay. Well, let me. One of the things that I said before, I'm going to skip some stuff and maybe come back to it. One of the things that is of interest is that in the new math, mathematicians were first used in developing curriculum. That was unheard of in the olden days. And there are many people who think that was a wonderful thing, and there are many people who think it was a terrible thing. It's interesting that Vaughan, who was a mathematician, I think was a bad influence, and took a brilliant high school teacher and made him into not such a brilliant teacher. It's interesting that, and I don't know if this is an accident or if this is a theme, exactly the same thing happened. After Max, the big project was a thing called the School Mathematics Study Group under Beagle. And that was the big competitor. It was much bigger than Max ever dreamed of being. It really influenced a huge number of schools. It had a huge budget. It developed huge amounts of curriculum and really did have some influence. So there was that. But then after that, there was the notion, let 100 flowers bloom, which was a kind of a takeoff on Mao Zedong's doctrine of. And so there were a dozen. There was the Matheson project, there was this project, there was a project at Southern under the direction of a guy named Bert Kaufman, who was also a math educator, very similar to Max. And he fell under the spell of a guy named Bob Exner at Syracuse University, who also had the idea that the way to teach mathematics in high school is to start with the basic principles of the propositional calculus and go from there, and every step had to be proved. And he too developed, and that project lasted for quite a long time. And I actually worked for that for some time.
Were all of these aimed at elite students?
Yes.
Is that okay. So the premise was you were talking to elite.
The premise was
for all was not.
The premise was we've got to beef up. I didn't tell the story for nothing. The premise was we have to beef up our capabilities in engineering and science, or we're going to be shot out of the water. And that was the premise. The notion of, and in fact, it was much later, and I can tell you exactly when, in 1967. The NSF came to Max and said, we got to do something for these kids in the inner cities because they're not being affected by this at all. And Max said, I got just the guy for you to do that. A guy who knows all about the inner city. That was the way Max operated. And his name is Peter Braunfeld. My knowledge of the inner city was that I lived on the north side of Chicago, and I went to school at the University of Chicago, and every day I took the L and wrote above the projects. I knew nothing about the inner city, but then I did write this thing. A bunch of us wrote this thing, and I'd like to talk about that someday. All right, so yes, it was not so much, it was for college-bound kids. The NSF always made noises about we've got to also educate the public because without a sympathetic public, none of this will work. And there was some truth in that, I think. So where was I with this? No, that's in the future yet. Oh, so they wanted to have a, yes, it was made for kids who were elitist.
Kaufman and
Well, Kaufman was at Southern, and that was for real elitists. That was a proposal that went in that was specifically aimed at the top 5% of math students. Yes, there's a hand up. Oh. So that was an elitist program.
you heard Sputnik.
In fact, you evaluated that program once.
Bernadine did.
Who did?
Bernadine.
Oh, Bernadine did, your wife? Yeah. And so that was another example of where the mathematicians got hold of something and kind of ruined it. So the question that I want to talk about.
Let me ask you a question then. Are we talking the Dulciani books?
No.
Okay.
The Dulciani books are, in my opinion, The Bossiani books are the result of these programs bastardized to where they could sell. They took some of the basic ideas and then they made them palatable so that they could avoid all the teacher training and all that stuff that was in. And I can talk about that next time, but I want to talk about mathematicians.
There was a reaction from the teachers. So,
Well, there were huge programs at one time that involved tens of thousands of teachers that ranged all the way to things like what were called academic year institutes. We ran those here, and there were thousands of teachers that went through those. And the program that I was especially involved with, get this, the idea was that they would bring a teacher here with his or her family, pay all their expenses for a year, actually, 2 semesters and a summer, put them up at Hendrick House and places like that. It was a full-time program, and it was at the end of which they got a master's degree in mathematics. It was slightly modified from the regular master's degree, but it was an honest master's degree. And for instance, the algebra program was a 3-semester program that culminated in Galois theory. So these teachers in principle were in a position to explain to you why there were 5th-degree equations that could not be solved by radicals. And that's pretty sophisticated. That isn't like, is this a group or isn't it a group? You know? And the same thing was true in analysis. They essentially had a complete foundation with everything, the Heine-Borel theorem and the Cauchy convergence theorem, all that stuff they knew. So there was a serious program. And by the way, I don't have numbers on this, but the facts are that many of those people became the elite of the NCTM and were the people responsible for the standards ultimately. A lot of those people were trained in programs like Academic Year Institute. But you can imagine how expensive that was. And my argument then, as it is now, was it's insanity. Why don't you do this in the pre-service program, where instead of paying them, you get them to pay you? It's insane to pour thousands of people incompetence into this field and then say at the taxpayer's expense, we're going to retrain all of you. That doesn't make any sense. Now, these days, there's still lip service. NSF, when I was there, and I'd like to talk about that someday, the mantra was, short-term fixes don't work. And I think that's an established fact, and we try to do a lot of short-term fixes and pretend they're not short-term. But that's the way it is. So mathematicians. People ask me, what do you think about mathematicians being involved? And I say, you know, it depends on the mathematician. And I have an analogy which I think is helpful. If you're trying to improve the health courses, is that what they still call it, health? In elementary school and high school?
Yeah.
Health, about how to avoid getting venereal diseases and stuff like that. If you're trying to improve the health courses and make a health curriculum, you would certainly think that a doctor might be a good idea to have in this team, right? And I don't mean just any old doctor. I mean a medical doctor who has the credentials of an MD degree. But that said, you wouldn't go out to look for the best brain surgeon that's around who's well known for this operation that's almost always fatal except when he does it. That's not who you would try to find. But that's exactly what they did in mathematics. They went to these high-powered mathematicians and asked them for opinions about things that they really were totally incompetent to judge. First of all, because they were much too smart. They didn't need all that stuff. Secondly, because they're strange to begin with. I mean, they are. I think it was my wife who pointed this out to me years ago. But she said, the fact of the matter, Peter, is that mathematicians are strange people. I said, what do you mean they're strange? She said, go down the photographs in Altgeld Hall and look at those faces and tell me that they're not strange. And it's true. So the idea was that the fact that a guy is a Nobel Prize winning, field medal prize winning mathematician does not qualify him for speaking authoritatively about the issue. You do want, I think PhDs are a nice thing to have, but you want people who have struggled maybe a little bit themselves. And then the other problem is the old saying about to a carpenter, everything looks like a hammer. And the best example of that is the guy, I wish that Ken Travers were here, but he's not. There was a guy at Southern who became the mentor to a program. Oh, it was actually a very famous program. What was the name of the civil rights guy? Bob Moses. Bob Moses got interested in high school mathematics, and this guy did exactly what he had a thing about that. What every child in this country needs to learn is graph theory. Graph theory. And so he spent 2 semesters teaching them the elements of graph theory. I think that's silliness. Every child in this country doesn't have to know what graph theory is all about. But that's what happens when you take a math educator, and by the way, Moses does have, I think, a degree in mathematics or something like it. So that's what I wanted to say about mathematicians. Pick your mathematician carefully. And the last thing I want to say is another thing that came up for ridicule that I want to just say something about. Everybody ridicules the fact that in the new math, we taught kids bases other than 10. You know what I'm talking about? Anybody not know what I'm talking about? Base 3. And so the question is, why would you want to do that? The argument that's frequently given for doing that, I think, is not a good argument, and that is, well, computers use base 2. And that's okay. It's nice to know that. It's nice to have some idea of why that is. But I think the argument should be a completely different argument. I think the argument for why learning bases to a certain degree is useful is the decimal system with its positional notation is one of the most profound things ever discovered or invented by the human beings. Civilization is almost impossible to think of without our system of representing numbers. And I say that even though the Chinese apparently are able to do it, but they're Chinese. It seems to me that it should be everybody's right to have some idea of what that's about, that this incredible thing that makes calculations possible and makes civilization possible, it is to, in my opinion, base notational notation is to mathematics what the alphabet is the writing and literature. And I think that that's something that everybody ought to know and ought to have some feeling for why that's true. And so that you want to give people a sense of these important things. And then the other reason, that's my last 2 sentences, is because you can't understand the decimal system without going outside of it and seeing things that are related to it. If you want to understand human anatomy, you don't just look at human skeletons. You go to the Natural History Museum and you look at chimpanzees and at cats and at dogs and at frogs, and you will learn a lot about the human skeleton. In fact, you can't even put it in its place unless you've seen these other skeletons, unless you've seen in what respects the decimal system is unique to 10, and in what respects it's just a generic something for lots of systems of that kind, you will not understand it. Now that doesn't mean, my last sentence, that doesn't mean that you should do what I've seen teachers do, which is to take kids who don't know their multiplication tables and memorize them in base 6. You know, that doesn't make any.
Well, it's better than 10.
But it's, I think, terribly important for people to get it out of their heads that everything you learn has to simply. I call it Dickens mathematics. It's the mathematics that Scrooge would like to have taught in his counting house so that the clerks can do their job and not complain. And that's what I think the business. So that's why I get my hackles up when people bash teaching bases other than 10, for example. And there's lots of examples. I'm done. No, I got 2 minutes. Any 2-minute questions? Listen, in 2 minutes, they can score 3 touchdowns. So